Okay, this week's Prasha, Prasha is Yisro, which the power of the Prasha, of course, is the fact that in this week's Prasha, the Jews are given the Torah. And again, I've mentioned many times that when we mark the year, so we start with Prashas and then we go through the whole story. When we hit Yaakov, it's like, whoa, the year is already like we're in the thick of it, and we already hit the Prashas that deal with Yaakov. And then you turn around and you're in Mitzrayim, and then you turn around and you're now standing at the foot of Mount Sinai. And it's just, things seem like they're flying. This parsha is really, the power of the parsha is the power of the Aseret HaDibros, of the revelation of God to the Jewish people. There are two things that I always like to do in this parsha, though I'm only doing one of them today. One is to talk about the parsha itself, and the other is to talk about the whole concept of revelation. And I think that I have spoken about it, and I will speak about it again. What this whole business of revelation was, and the whole business of Maimon Har Sinai. Why was that such an important moment in Jewish time? It wasn't that we got the Torah. We didn't receive the Torah on that day, which corresponds to the day of the 6th of Sivan. We received divine revelation on that day. We received nothing tangible. The tangible thing that we received was only 40 days later when Moshe Rabbeinu came down, and then came the whole story of the golden calf. But that was not, Moshe didn't receive anything. What we got divine revelation. What makes it even more incredible is that everything, and I think I've mentioned this, that everything that happens from the time of the gathering of the Jews into Mitzrayim until we left Mitzrayim and until we stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, every event was really a root-laying event, was a foundation-laying event for the eventuality of a nation being able to keep the Torah. And that everything that took place gave us another midah, another characteristic, in order to be able to be a nation of law keepers, and a nation of people that had the ability to be able to follow a God and to be able to follow His Torah, which means then that this parsha, as we're getting closer to the divine revelation and closer to God giving us the Torah, so that means that everything that happened in this week's parsha are the absolute fundamental foundations that are necessary. What makes that even more surprising then is that makes even the name of this parsha even more surprising. That one would have imagined that there would have been a better name, or there would have been a more appropriate Jewish name to choose to name this parsha. Perhaps even name it the parsha of Torah. Perhaps to name it the parsha of Moshe. But to name it the parsha of Yisro, and what seems to be, because Yisro came up with a system of delegation, of a system of splitting up the sages in order to be able to judge and to teach Torah to the people, which is a critical thing, because it's something that Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't have handled himself. Nevertheless, it's difficult to understand how that should be the foundation. That should be like the final steps that are taken in order to be able to prepare for the giving of the Torah. It was almost as if this was one of the last things that you needed in order to be able to concretize all of those things, like we learned in yesterday's Mishnah, that to take all of these things and to put them into one small thing upon which we then base everything else, and all the other lessons that we learned are really seen through this. Hard to understand why Yisro is that parsha, is that person and personality that leads up to the giving of the Torah. We also know that why the Chazal say that why was this parsha called Yisro, because Yisro was Yiser. He added a parsha to the Torah. It's difficult how he added something to the Torah. That means that God left something out and Yisro added in. It's a weird statement that Yisro added something into the Torah. So we have to understand exactly what that means, that Yisro added something into the Torah. Parsha begins, Vayishma Yisro Kohen Midjon Chosein Moshe, that the Yisro, who was the Kohen Midjon, to let us know what his past was. That he wasn't born a tzaddik. He grew up as a Kohen Midjon, as somebody who was not only an adherent to another religion, but he was a functionary in another religion. He became eventually the Chosein Moshe, so he must have had some incredible zechusim, some incredible merits, Now, it's not clear exactly when this parsha was said, whether this parsha happened before the giving of the Torah or after the giving of the Torah. Be that as it may, the Torah tells us, Vayishma Yisro. Yisro heard all the things, everything that God did to the Jewish people and to Moshe. Rashi himself asked the question, Vayishma Yisro, Mashmu Shamo Ba, what did Yisro hear that caused him to come and attach himself to the Jewish people? He heard about Kriyas Yamsuf, and he heard about Mechamas Amalek. He heard about the splitting of the sea, and he heard about the fight with the Amalekites, the war with the Amalekites. The commentaries in the Medrash ask the question, and they say that was Yisro the only person that heard? Everybody heard this. Everybody knew about the splitting of the sea. Everybody knew about the Yetzias Mitzrayim, about the Exodus of Egypt. Everybody knew about the war with Amalek. The pasuk even says in last week's parsha, in the Shira, it says Shamu Amim Yirgazun Chil Achaz Yoshvei Falashas, that everybody heard this. Everybody was quite aware, and they were agitated. Terror gripped the dwellers of Palashas. So this was something that was known around the world. So if that's the case, what was the difference between Yisro and the rest of the world? That Mashmu Shama Uba, says Rashi. What is it that Yisro heard and that caused him to come, whereas everybody else heard and didn't come? So if you analyze that and think about that very carefully, then really what the difference is between Yisro and the rest of the world is that everybody heard. So it wasn't Vayishma Yisro. Vayishma Yisro and every other Tom, Dick, and Harry. Everybody heard. But it was really the godless of Yisro was not that he heard. The greatness of Yisro was that he came, that it caused him to do something. So then really the parsha should have began, Vayavai Yisro, Kayin Midjon. That Yisro came. Hearing what God did wasn't the greatness of Yisro. Doing what Yisro did, that was the greatness of Yisro. So why does the parsha begin with Vayishma, with Yisro heard? One of the messages that we get from the opening word of this week's parsha, which I think is where it all lies, is that there is hearing and there is hearing. Two people can hear exactly the same thing, and one person understands and one person doesn't. And it's not because one understands the language and one doesn't understand the language, but the difference is that, and there are a few differences. One is that a person can't hear because he's too busy talking. Because when we're talking, when we're putting out, we're not taking in. And the greatness of hearing, the ability to hear, is often nothing more complicated than just being quiet. And when we listen, we can hear incredible things. The second is, the reason why many people don't hear is because we're not objective. Because we hear subjective, we hear what we want to hear, we hear from the place that we want to hear it from, and that we can't consider something that we haven't thought about, something that's not coming from inside of us. You know, the great machlokas between Hillel and Shammai, we say that we paskin, we follow the law like Hillel, except for a few exceptions. And when we follow the law like Hillel, we wonder, why is the law like Hillel? So there's all kinds of beautiful explanations. But the simplest explanation that our sages give us is because whenever Hillel said something, he first said the opinion of Shammai. He said over the opinion of Shammai, and then he said over his opinion. And that meant that he was open to considering what somebody else said. He was listening in an objective way. And when you listen in an objective way, you hear many different things. But there is something more. Because how do we hear? So we assume, certainly those of us that are not scientists, we assume that we hear because we open our ears. And we say that often, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, right? Listen with your ears. Are your ears open? But it really isn't the ears that are hearing. It's really the heart that's hearing. And that when you listen with your heart, so then you understand and you internalize and it moves you. What Rashi is asked, what Rashi is bringing from the Medrash, that Vayishma Yisro Mashmua Shama Uba, It's not talking about the coming of Yisro. It's not focusing on the coming, and therefore the pasuk should be amended to say Vayava Yisro. What Rashi is telling us is that Mashmua Shama. What kind of hearing did Yisro have that was different than the hearing of the rest of the entire world? Yisro heard in a way that his body was moved, which tells me that how was Yisro listening? Yisro was listening not with his ears, but Yisro was hearing with his heart. When you hear with your ears, in fact, that's not really even hearing. It's just taking in sounds. Therefore, Yisro was in fact the only person in the entire world that heard what happened to the Jewish people, that heard about the splitting of the sea, that heard about the fight with Amalek, that heard about the manna, that heard about the giving of the Torah. Yisro was the only one that heard, because Yisro was the only one that changed. The focus is not on the change. The focus is on the style of hearing, on the way of listening. And that's why the Parsha begins, Vayishma Yisro. This man is unique. This man was special because he was able to actually listen to what was going on in the world, to hear the messages and the sounds of what he was experiencing, which then caused him to do something. It caused him to make a change. Reb Shalom Shvadron brings a very beautiful mashal, a beautiful example. He says you take a farm boy who comes into the city. He's never seen a train before in his life. He comes into the city, they show him what a train is, and he's standing on the platform, and he hears this incredible whistle. And he leans over the tracks to see what's coming. What's that sound that he's hearing? And as the sound is approaching and getting closer, he's hearing this incredible sound. Until finally, he's watching, he sees a light, he hears a sound, but he has no idea what that sound is. He has no idea that that's connected to the train. And suddenly the train slams into him. And not only didn't he get the message to step back, he actually got harmed by it. That's the same by Yisro and the rest of the world. Everybody else heard about the miracles, they heard about Yetzias Mitzrayim, but it was just a sound to them. It was an interesting sound because they were listening only with their ears and they had no understanding of what it represented. And it's ki'ilu that there was no sound there at all because it didn't help them. Yisro, on the other hand, had the ability to listen and to hear, oh, that sound is a siren. That sound is a horn. That sound is teaching me and telling me something. And Yisro's being, his heart, his understanding, was able to grab onto that sound and to let that sound inform him and to shape the actions that he was going to do. They say over a beautiful thing in last week's Parsha, that the maidservant at the sea saw a vision at the sea of God and God's hand, which was greater than our greatest prophets. That Rasa Shivcha Shebayam, the maidservant at the sea, perhaps the lowest person, the simplest person, was able to see an incredibly detailed vision to the extent that every Jew pointed at the sea and said, Zeh Keli v'anvehu, that is my God, and I will beautify him. That is the God of my fathers Varom Menu, and I will elevate him and elevate myself towards him. The rabbis ask, why is she called a Shivcha Shebayam? If she saw a vision where she could point and say, Zeh Keli v'anvehu, that's my God, then she wasn't a Shivcha, she was a Neviah. She became a prophet. So why was she called a Shivcha Shebayam? So the Balei Musar says something so stunning. Because she saw it, she was moved by it. She said, isn't that the most incredible thing? Zeh Keli v'anvehu, that's my God. And then she went to sleep and woke up the next morning, and she bleibte Shivcha. She stayed the same person that she was. She never really saw or heard that vision because it didn't change her. When we see things, when we experience things that become mere experiences, fabulous experiences, incredible experiences. They seem to touch some place inside of us, but they don't change our lives. So then we haven't really seen them and we haven't really heard them. We hear stuff all the time, but we don't really hear because we don't move ourselves. We hear shiurim, we hear drashas, and they touch us. We know they're beautiful. We know that there's something there. But like the farm boy, all we're hearing is really hearing the sound. We're not really hearing the message. We mentioned the pasuk Shamu Amim Yirgazun, that the people heard and they were agitated. Chil achaz yoshvei pelashas, terror gripped the dwellers of Philistia. That means that they really did hear it. It means that they touched them somewhere deep. They even sang, the Medrash says, that they even sang Shira. They even sang a song to God. They did. But they didn't move. They didn't change. It didn't pick them. They didn't pick themselves up and move on to the next place. Reshape their existence because of what they had just experienced. So you have to wonder, are we deaf? Is it that we can't hear? You know, there's a way to know that you're getting older. When you go to a chasna and you walk into the chasna and the first thing you say to the person you're with is, "Oh, the music is so loud," you know you've gotten there. You've gotten to that place where now those sounds are making you crazy. You try to have a conversation at a wedding where the music is on, and you can't have a conversation. And it's not that you can't hear the other person, but it's because there's too much sound, there's too much noise, and you can't hear the real sounds. You know, very often singers will sing beautiful words from Chazal. They'll sing words from Psukim. They'll sing words from Shashirim. They'll sing beautiful words that are from Tefillah, words that are mamish touching. But the music is so loud, and I don't mean in decibels, but that it takes over to the extent that you can't really hear the essence. You can't even let your heart become attached to those words because the noise that's on around you is distracting. The truth is that that's the way the Yetzer Hara works. That when a person starts to hear and a person's heart starts to open, the Yetzer Hara just pounds in more noise. There is so much noise that you become distracted and you can't really hear and focus on the things that are going on. And that's why we can miss things that happen. We're open. We're people that like to listen with our hearts. We like to assimilate and understand the things that are happening around us. But there's so much that's happening around us that we don't even know sometimes where to focus. There are huge things going on in the world. We spoke about it a little bit on Monday. There are in the world that we're living in, there are huge things going on. And then there are things that are just not important. But unfortunately, what happens because there's so much noise is that we tend to focus, we tend to hear the wrong things, and it obscures our ability to hear, really hear, to hear with our hearts, because there's just so much going on. Our rabbis identify that Yisro was a Gilgul Neshama for Kayin. A Gilgul Neshama means that it was a reincarnation of sorts. Whatever that means, I have no idea. And I don't hear these Kabbalistic things and say to myself, they have nothing to say to me. This is some Kabbalistic hoo-ha. It's got nothing to do with me. If you boil it down, you can hear something amazing from it. What does it mean that Yisro was a Gilgul Neshama for Kayin? Because what was Kayin's biggest problem? It wasn't that he got mad. People get mad. It wasn't that he got embarrassed. People get embarrassed. It was that he couldn't hear. Because God came to Kayin and said to him that if you watch yourself, if you grab a hold of yourself, if you control yourself, everything's going to be fine. And if not, then Pesach Chatas Revetz, then your sin croucheth by the door. It's going to destroy you. And how do we know that he heard this with his ears? Because the Medrash says he told it over to Cain, to Hevel. Then he had a conversation with Hevel about it. And then at the end of the conversation, he picked up a rock and he killed him. He heard it. It went into his ears, but he was listening with his ears. He wasn't listening with his heart. Yisro came along to be Mesakein, to fix that problem. Yisro came along to teach us that when you listen, you have to listen with your heart. You have to listen with the assumption that there's a message that's here for me. What's the message that I'm going to take from this? And that's why Yisro needed to be the preamble for the Torah. Because he was Yiser Parsha B'Torah. He added a Parsha to the Torah. He added a depth to the Torah. Because this is one of the last fundamental qualities that we need in order to be able to receive Torah. We have to be able to hear, not just with our ears, but to be able to hear with our hearts. We have to be able to listen objectively, to be able to hear things and feel them, and not merely just hear the sounds. I mentioned in the very, very beginning of Corona, it's kimat a year ago. I gave a shir, and I believe, that was before, it predated us, but I spoke about a mashal that I had heard from Rabbi Beryl Wine, that he said that, imagine you're in a foreign country, and the king of the foreign country, and you speak Yiddish, where you come from, you speak Yiddish, and the king from the foreign country gets up, and he starts to speak in Yiddish. So your initial reaction is, whoa, that's so amazing. The guy knows Yiddish. Wow, that's incredible. Nobody I know knows Yiddish, and this guy from some foreign country knows Yiddish. Then you realize, wait a second, who's he speaking to? Obviously speaking to me, because I'm the only one that speaks Yiddish. So this message that he's saying, that message is for me. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in this whole thing, is speaking in Yiddish. He started off speaking in Yiddish in China, even though the President of the United States says we're not allowed to say that word anymore. But he started speaking in China, and then it started to get closer, and it started to get closer, and now he's speaking to me in Yiddish in my land, in my place, amongst my people. And I have to be listening. Not listening with my ears, but listening with my heart. If after a year of being in this matzav, and I could speak now for hours about what matzav we're really in, besides bidud, and besides seger, and besides hypocrisy, and besides all the crazy things we're seeing around us, but we're in a position where every day we say tomorrow's going to get better. Next week, in Yirtzeh Hashem, it's going to be better. Next month, 3 months from now, we're looking and processing things in a very, very different way. If we have not become different people, so then we haven't been listening. Vayishma Yisro, Mashmua Shama Uba. How did Yisro hear that it helped him change himself? Yisro heard not with his ears, Yisro heard with his heart. And that we need for Kabbalah Torah, for the receiving of Torah. If we listen to things with our hearts, then the sounds are different, and our entire lives move and acclimate to those messages that we're hearing with our ears. Just a thought. Keep in mind when you learn the Prasha, there is, I will tell you, I'll give you a little homework. It's an Orach Chaim, based on an Orach Chaim, but there is another pasuk that gives us the final step of preparation for the giving of the Torah. And the pasuk says, just give me 1 minute. At the very beginning of the last part of the Parsha, which is the introduction, chapter 19. Bayom HaShlishi L'Tzeis B'nei Yisrael. It's actually in Pasuk Beis. So Pasuk Aleph is that on the third day when they left Mitzrayim, on this day, the third day after, and the third month, that after they left Mitzrayim, so then Bayom Hazeh, on that day, Bo Midbar Sinai, they came to the Sinai desert. Vayisu meRefidim, they left Refidim, which was the place they fought with the Amalekites. But of course they left Refidim because they came to the desert. So why is the Torah telling me that? Vayavo Midbar Sinai, they came to Midbar Sinai. You just told me that 6 words ago. Vayachanu Mamidbar, and they camped in the desert. Vayichan Sham Yisrael. What should have been written in plural is written in singular. Vayichan Sham Yisrael neged ahar. They rested by the mountain. Says the Or Chaim, those 3 pieces of the pasuk are the final 3 preparations that a Jew needs in order to be able to receive the Torah. I've led you to the water. Now you need to drink. If you look at those very carefully, you will see what the 3 final preparations are. Maybe on Sunday morning, I'll quickly just mention those 3. It's a very beautiful understanding. Okay. Everybody should have a beautiful, amazing, wonderful day and a beautiful, amazing, uplifting Shabbos. Our rabbis tell us that on every Shabbos, where there is every Shabbos in the Parsha, there is a midah that comes from the Parsha. There is a schus in the Parsha. There is an energy that comes from the Parsha. We should all be zocha to the energy of having our ears open, our hearts engaged, and that we should hear the incredible words of the Torah. We should hear the incredible message that God is sending us on a daily basis, and it should uplift and shape our lives. Have a wonderful, beautiful Shabbos.
Rabbi, there's a question in the chat. How do we hear with our hearts?
How do we listen with our hearts? Hearing is not enough, is not thoughtful. Hearing is not thoughtful. We hear without thinking. That's the answer to the question, that we hear without thinking. And we don't look at it and say, why did I just experience this? Why did I just go through this? Why did I just meet that person? Why did I just have this event happen in my life? Why did I have to hear that message? You flip on your computer and all of a sudden you get hit with a message you weren't expecting. Why did I need to hear that? Why did I need to witness that? Those are the questions that a person has to ask when they hear things. What is this saying to me? Not to you, because I don't need to be there to read your life, but I need there to be able to read my life. Why am I experiencing this? Why am I going through this the way I'm going through it? Which then allows us, by the way, I don't have to worry about why an event is happening in the world. I can never answer that question because God is doing it. I don't know. But why do I have to be connected to this? What do I get to learn from this? Okay? Okay, my pleasure. Have a good Shabbos, everyone. It's always great to see everybody.
Can I just ask something?
Sure.
As I was listening to you, I just had a feeling that that Moses and Yisro would have had different mentalities. They both came from different places, different status, different faces. And I'm just wondering whether that had anything to do with the way that Yisro actually reacted. And
it's an important point, because one of the reasons that Yisro was able to see things different than Moshe did, because he didn't have the experiences that Moshe had, and therefore he was able to see it from an objective way. And it's just a very simple thing. Very often we get caught up in something. We get brought up a certain way. We're taught to think a certain way, and when a problem happens, we deal with the problem the way that we would normally deal with it. And that's why Yisro, one of the important things here is that Yisro wasn't a meddling father-in-law, right? He wasn't a pain in the neck shver. I mean, he came and he was able to see things in a way that Moshe couldn't see. And it wasn't that God couldn't have instructed Moshe, but God wanted Moshe to be able to understand this, to see it, and Moshe wasn't able to. And that it's another important thing that we learn. Taking advice from people is a big thing. Who was the gadol in that story? Moshe or Yisro? So Yisro was a giant. He was great. But Moshe was great because he was able to listen to Yisro. He was able to hear what he said.
in different ways.
And they were coming from completely different places. That's right. Completely different places. Okay, have a beautiful day, everyone. Beautiful Shabbos.